Today we have an amazing show for you guys today. It is truly an honor for me to talk to him and to dissect his brain. We have Mr. Peter Sjöstedt. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but it is a difficult name. It is a Swedish name, so I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it. But nonetheless, it is an amazing show because I don't think that I've ever had somebody on like him that is so knowledgeable in philosophy. And not just philosophy, but philosophy of the mind, philosophy when it comes to psychedelics, philosophy when it comes to the outlook on life and the meaning of life itself. And this is one of those episodes where I think I'll go back and listen to over and over again, because when he was talking to me live on a podcast, I really had been lost for 2-3 times because the information was still processing in my stupid caveman brain, and I wasn't able to completely grasp what he was talking to me about until I listened to it again. So if you guys can't hang on for any moment or any of those rants that me and him went on, do feel free to go back and rewind the episode and play it again, because it is a rather heavy episode, really dense with information and philosophy and ideas. And I think this is probably one of my favorite episodes. And I know I say this a lot about the episodes, but this is truly one of my favorite episodes because his ideas are really fresh, at least to me. And I think they are needed and missing in the psychedelic world that we are living in today, at least in psychedelia, where this is kind of like an echo chamber where we repeat ideas over and over again, where we have people trying to be the next Terence McKenna or whatever the case may be. But Peter is a really, really deep thinker, and he breaks all the rules, and I really love it. If you guys have been listening to this podcast for a while now, you guys will kind of get the pattern that I really, really like the people that breaks all the rules, that doesn't follow the pattern, that is kind of anti or counterculture in a way to anything. So I really like Peter's perspective. I think this is a really good episode. And if you guys want to, please feel free to microdose a little bit and listen to this episode. I promise it will have some crazy, mind-blowing effects. So I hope you guys enjoy this episode. And before we start it, I want to apologize because I've had some technical difficulties when I was recording this episode. I didn't know, but my good mic actually wasn't on, and the mic that picked up my audio, my end of the audio, was my MacBook Pro mic. So the audio for my side is really kind of shitty, but Peter's audio was excellent. So that was a little glitch that happened to me, and I'm sorry for my shitty audio output. Nonetheless, I don't talk too much on this episode, and hope you guys will enjoy it. This episode, we welcome Mr. Peter Sjöstedt. I had an amazing time talking to Peter. This is one of my favorite episodes, and I know I say this a lot about all the other episodes, but this is truly one of my favorites. And I think Peter is the real deal, because there's a lot of quasi-pseudo philosophers out there in the psychedelic world and psychedelia in general that label themselves as quote-unquote futurist, and they will throw on these word salads together that are trying to impress the audience and throw on these big words, these adjectives that make themselves sound fancy and more important than they actually are, but in fact their message lacks a lot of substance. And I'm sure you guys know who I'm talking about. There's a lot of them in the podcasting community when it comes to psychedelics, because there's just not a lot of words to describe our experience sometimes in the psychedelic world. And when they come back into our reality and they try to describe their DMT trips, they're using words that they don't even understand to describe their experience, and it just sounds really, really pretentious. And I can assure you that Peter is not one of those people, because the way that he explains his philosophies are really simple to understand, and he is a really deep thinker. You can tell by the way he speaks, by the way he thinks, that he is really deeply interested in these philosophies and these ideas. And I really, really appreciate people like Peter, because we definitely need more people like Peter out there in the world that are philosophers for the mind and for psychedelics. So without further ado, please welcome Peter Sjöstedt. Okay, I'm here with Peter. I don't know how you pronounce your last name. How do you say your last name?
It's Peter Sjöstedt-H.
Okay, I'm not even gonna try that. But is it a Swedish name?
It's a Swedish name, yeah. I mean, really, it's pronounced Sjöstedt, but that's even more difficult. But to think of it just as Sjö and then Stedt.
Okay, Sjöstedt.
Yeah, exactly.
The H at the end is silent.
Ah, right, yeah.
Okay.
The H is actually short for Hughes, but I just find Peter Sjöstedt Hughes to be too long, you know. So it's just shorten it to Peter Sjöstedt H.
Okay, so you are a philosopher based in UK, and I find you very interesting because not only are you a philosopher, but you've had psychedelic experiences, and you're also doing your PhD topic on Panpsychism. Is that how you pronounce it?
Almost Panpsychism, yeah.
Okay, so let's start with that, because that's a very interesting philosophy. Now, I don't have a lot of knowledge in that philosophy, but I did do a little Wikipedia search beforehand, and the Wikipedia definition of that philosophy is that the consciousness, mind, and soul is a universal or primordial feature of all things. So meaning there are minds and souls and consciousness in every living or non-living material on awareness and on Earth, in space. So can you give a deeper explanation of what that is to you?
Okay. Well, Panpsychism very basically is that mind is universal, ubiquitous. So everything has minds, not only animals, complex animals such as humans or goats or whatever, or octopuses, but everything. So we're going down to single cell amoebas, but even beyond that to molecules, atoms, and to the subatomic ultimately. Now this of course sounds completely crazy to people who have never come across the idea before, but it's a very ancient doctrine. You see it in the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, see a little bit in Plato and Aristotle, and throughout history in the Renaissance, people like Bruno, Telesio, people like that, they were all in favor of it. Sorry, still early morning here, and in the modern age, it's become a popular belief again. Why? Because in philosophy and science and psychology, really, there's this thing called the explanatory gap, or the hard problem of consciousness, which is the problem of how mind relates to matter, or how consciousness relates to the brain. Because no matter how detailed your information about the brain is, you still cannot know, or you still cannot explain from knowing the workings of the brain, in other words, spatiotemporal movements, how consciousness is related to that. So how it's either identical to that, or how it emerges from that, or if the brain and the mind both have a common cause. So this is one reason for panpsychism, because all the other explanations, the most common being emergentism, that the mind emerges from the brain, ends in these paradoxes or contradictions or cul-de-sacs. So in other words, instead of saying that somehow the mind emerges from the brain, it's actually more parsimonious to say that consciousness, or a form really of sentience, basic feeling, was there all along. It never suddenly popped into existence out of nothing, something I call the Big Pang theory, pang of consciousness. It was always there, and it only emerges in degree. So if you believe that consciousness was always there to a very small extent, or basic extent rather, then these problems later on resolve themselves to a greater degree.
So what you're indicating is that consciousness is non-local, meaning it's something that is generated by the brain. Is that correct?
Well, it's you have to be. I have to be careful to distinguish consciousness from sentience. So I think that consciousness depends on the brain, like a symphony depends on an orchestra. But likewise, a sound doesn't depend on an orchestra. And so sentience, which is basic feeling, it need not be conscious, such as, a feeling of hunger or fear, something like that. That exists throughout nature. Matter is only an abstraction from the concrete, which includes that. So the brain, you do need a brain for human consciousness, but the brain itself is not the producer of sentience.
So what do you think that is, where is sentience producing from in that sense?
Well, I don't think that when you say that something is produced, it sort of means that it's not fundamental. So something exists and thereafter its product comes. But I'm saying that sentience is not produced. It's a fundamental element of reality, just like we would say matter energy is.
Right. So that's very interesting, because that thought itself is indicating that there is sentience in every subatomic particle on this universe, right?
That's right.
So do they also experience hunger or other humanistic traits that we carry as well?
Well, you can only speculate about that. I mean, I can only infer what other humans feel. I can tell through their behaviour. If someone's sort of salivating, I sort of infer they're hungry, for example. I do that to a dog as well, and to a mouse, perhaps. And then the question becomes, how far down the line do you go? I mean, obviously, for an entity that does not eat in the way we eat, I would not imagine something like hunger, but nonetheless, I'd imagine some kind of desire there, something which sustains their existence. So, for example, a plant, we generally think that plants are non-conscious, but if you think of the plant itself as a sort of brain in itself, then of course you can imagine, just as you imagine with other people, that when they get nutrition, sunlight, water, whatever, they'll feel a sort of satisfaction analogous to the ones we feel. But not the same, of course. I'm not saying that everything has the same forms of consciousness that we humans have. Right. But the ultimate, another reason for believing in panpsychism here is this, that we don't know, we can't prove that other humans have consciousness. We can only infer it through looking at their brains and looking at their behavior. How about when you come to let's say an octopus? I mean, they display very intelligent behavior, they can work out mazes and so on. So we infer that they have consciousness, but their brains are completely different from ours. They have 2/3 of an octopus's brain is in its arms. But nonetheless, I think it's more plausible to assume they have got consciousness. And we go down the line of simplicity in organisms. And to draw a line anywhere to say this organism is conscious and this one is not seems to be completely arbitrary. So it just seems more parsimonious ultimately to say that there is a sort of a degree of sentience which continues all the way down the line.
Is that kind of what the shamans of the Amazon, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but if you ever do ayahuasca with some Amazonian shamans, they will tell you that there is spirits in every living thing on this planet or even in outer space. And when you kind of hear that, you sort of picture this cartoonish imagery where there is an invisible spirit living inside the desk or your chair or something like that. But what they're really talking about is this energy or spark or some kind of source that's within every object and living being. And Is that kind of what that philosophy is sort of talking about?
It's related to that. I mean, we traditionally would call something like that animism, the notion that, you know, all these trees have spirits and whatever. It's certainly related to that. And, you know, if I'm saying that a plant has a form of sentience, it suddenly seems not as implausible when a shaman will say that there are spirits of the vines or whatever. I don't know that much about South American shamans, though, so I can only guess. But it is akin to that. What I'd say is that when you use a word like spirit or soul, though, it makes it almost seem as if that form of sentience is separate from the matter in which it is manifest. And there are forms of panpsychism which are dualists like that. But I think that my take on it is this, that for each form of sentience, really, there is a corresponding form of matter energy, because matter energy itself is not a real thing. It's just an abstraction, in other words, a part of what's really real. So these vines and trees in the Amazon and whatnot, I do think it's plausible they have a form of sentience, and this form of sentience somehow might be spoken of in the regard you say. But like I say, it's not really my field.
Right. So how did you come to this conclusion that everything on our existence level have sentience? It sort of slowly emerged to me, this view. So at university, I studied the classic philosophers and modern ones and whatever. One of my favorites was Nietzsche. There's a common favorite amongst 20-year-old men, really, seems somehow. And Kant as well, who was a German philosopher, died in 1824. And Nietzsche had this notion of the will to power, which is very basically, it's this fundamental drive that pushes all of life. It's not consciousness, but it's not matter either. It's a sort of almost like a subconscious instinct. And I was always interested in this, but there are different interpretations of it. But eventually, after university, that actually led me to reading Schopenhauer, who was another German philosopher who inspired Nietzsche at first. And he talks about the will. His main book is called The World as Will and Representation. And he says that everything we see around us is but a representation of the real entity that is the will. And by will, he didn't mean consciousness, like I say, but you could classify as a form of mind, again, a sort of drive. But for Schopenhauer, it's more a drive to survival rather than Nietzsche's drive to power or development. So I got very interested in Schopenhauer. And then this led me on to, I also studied Henri Bergson at university. But all of these thinkers pushed me on to another English thinker called Alfred North Whitehead, who developed a form of panpsychism, which was very detailed in exposition and very convincing once you get through the sort of difficult language. And so from that, that's led now to the PhD I'm doing, which is on panpsychism, but with a large focus on Alfred North Whitehead. So how does panpsychism differ from the mainstream philosophy that is dominating our culture today, which is the scientific culture? Because in modern science, we talk about inanimate objects, and we know they have atoms. We know that they are made out of the same stuff that we are made out of on a subatomic level. But we don't, as scientists, we don't call these objects, like, we don't say they're sentient. You know what I mean? Like, we don't classify them as something that has a form of sentience. So how does that differ from our mainstream model today? And do you think that the way that we look at the universe through our scientific lens, do you think that point of view is dangerous to our philosophy as mankind?
Okay, yeah. Well, two questions there. Is it dangerous and how does it differ? Right. Well, I mean, generally speaking, the scientific method of the modern age has been very successful in creating technology, medicine, weapons, and in predicting the future. It's been a real aid to the development of countries and civilization. But that method, many people would say that method comes ultimately from Descartes, René Descartes, French philosopher, who was a dualist. He believed that the world is divided into two main substances, and that is matter, which is completely mechanical, mathematical, and thus predictable, and something that one can put into models. And then on the other side, there's a soul, and Descartes thought only humans had souls, not even animals. Now, what seems to have happened is that at least our Western civilization has taken half of that, the mechanical side, the mathematical sort of dead side, and discarded the religious soul part, and said, let's just work with this, and that's been very successful. But ultimately, what that side does is it excludes sentience in the first place. So it's working with an abstraction. It's like working with a model and not the concrete reality. This has led to our scientific worldview, but we must remember that science is only a method, really. It's not a dogma. It shouldn't really say, what exists and what doesn't, but rather what works and what doesn't. So within this framework, there have then been attempts to explain how consciousness fits into that, So if you've got a dead mechanical world of just ultimately pure movement, describable in spatial and temporal terms, then and this is part of the explanatory gap, it's impossible, in principle, to explain how consciousness comes out of that, because it doesn't matter how complicated the pattern or the functioning of the sort of neurology of the brain is. Still, from movement, you can only get movement. You can't get, for example, an emotion, the feeling of happiness, simply by saying that it's correlated to dopamine or something like this, or serotonin in the brain. All you can show is a correlation. The explanatory gap is that, from correlation, you cannot get an explanation in terms of a cause or an identity. So, and also when you look into these theories like emergentism, as dominant view today, like I said, that the mind emerges from the brain, there are all these paradoxes, such as mental causation. So if you're a pure physicalist, you'll believe that only physical things can cause physical things. However, that would mean that the mind has no power to affect reality. There would be no mental causation, which would mean something like, if I really tried to work something out, some difficult philosophical book or mathematical equation, that would actually be completely powerless. It would have no effect on the result. It would mean that any beliefs I harbored had no effect upon my life. So you get these strange paradoxes. It would mean that the statement, I am conscious, was not caused by my consciousness. This is something called Epiphenomenalism, that consciousness is a mere after effect of brain functioning. It would also not make it would. There's this argument which Karl Popper spoke of, which is basically that epiphenomenalism doesn't work in terms of evolution, because it seems that consciousness serves an evolutionary purpose. It makes us who we are as humans, able to predict the universe and whatever. So if we reject epiphenomenalism, we accept mental causation, that the mind actually can have effect upon the world. But if we accept that, then we're sort of saying that there's a causal power which is not physicalist. And if you identify the mind with the matter, that also comes into a lot of, that also ends in paradoxes. So you can't resolve it that way. Saul Kripke spoke about that, for example. So my ultimate point here is that we must realize that thinking about reality only in terms of matter-energy is not a sufficient explanation of what reality is, according to our own experience. It's non-empirical even. So the second question was, is there a danger in that? Well, some people have argued that if you believe that the world around you is completely inanimate, completely dead, then it sort of gives you a license to treat it as you please, and thus this could result in the sort of ecological crisis that we've created for ourselves, because without believing that nature itself has a inherent value in terms of sentience, we can abuse it as much as we will.
So I'm still trying to understand and grasp the concept of panpsychism, but so correct me if I'm wrong, but is it, in other words, saying that human beings were just a part of this bigger system that is ultimately everything is sentient, but we just have a different form of it? And
yeah, that's right.
We're no bigger or have any other advantage than trees or rocks or rivers or water, but we're just another form of sentient beings. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So, I would say that humans probably have a very complex form of consciousness. We have all the five senses to start with. Some organisms only have one sense, perhaps. We have a great form of imagination. We can sort of foresee, predict the future, a good memory, and good forms of extending memory into written form and whatnot. So, but ultimately, I'm saying that everything has a sentience. Consciousness is only a complicated form of sentience. So yes, you're right.
Do you think there's an evolutionary advantage to having consciousness?
Yeah, I do, because what distinguishes mankind above the other animals is that we are intelligent. What does that mean? It means we can look at past regularities, create a sort of law out of them, and then use that law in order to manipulate the future to our own ends. So that form of intelligence is part of our consciousness, and no doubt that is responsible for the development of our civilization and technology.
Right.
Of course, that provides. I would certainly say that provides an evolutionary advantage.
Mm-hmm. But can somebody argue that it is better to live like animals do, where they have to go with nature and go with what they have in front of them and work with that and be accordance to nature, instead of being human beings that we manipulate nature and we make nature work around us instead of the other way around? I would think that if you live like animals, like dolphins or whales or whatever, it's a more efficient way to live, and the resources won't run out as fast as how we're doing things now, where we're really manipulating nature at its deepest core. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yes, and I suppose that ultimately comes to the question of what the purpose of life is. So if you think that the purpose of life is to live in happiness and harmony, you'd probably be better off as a sort of animal. Not all, obviously, not. But
rats.
Not rats, maybe no, but like a dolphin, it seems like a nice life, doesn't it? But
right.
Of course, the question is that the purpose of life? Just happiness and comfort, or is the purpose of life a constant evolution? A progression. That's the way we've been going. That doesn't mean it needs to be therefore the way. But there's this sort of a dichotomy between the purpose of life being about harmony, or about being, or rather, being progression. Harmony or progression? That is the question. So if it's about progression, then it seems that our intelligence and our way of manipulating nature to our ends is a good thing. And if it's about harmony, we might have been better off. Some people say that, the peasants of the 13th century were better off than, 9-to-5 office workers today. They only work 3 hours a day, apparently, and so on and so forth. This is a deep philosophical question. Ultimately, what's the meaning of life? You answer that, and then you can answer the second question. Personally, I don't think that happiness is the purpose of life. I prefer the view of progress, but that's not necessarily technological progress. And I think at least we realize that, the progress of our technology can be detrimental to our own lives in terms of pollution and whatever. And thus, as a result of that, of course, we're now fighting back against that. But that, again, is part of our intelligence. You know, we realize the damage we're doing, and we realize it because we can do all these scientific experiments to decipher that. And plus, of course, just see our environment. You know, if we see pollution, that's a direct harm to our aesthetic senses.
So we talk about our technological advances, and I think this is a really hot topic of today, or today's world, because every day we see new technology integrating into our personal lives, whether it's the newest iPhone or Apple Watch. Basically, we have been merging with the machines for a while now, and I don't think a lot of people realize that, because they think that these machines and programs and software, hardware, they're exterior to us, but really, wherever we go in the Western society, we carry our phones with us. We're always connected to the grid, and
yes.
Whatever we're doing, we seem to always go back to checking our phones, or either through Facebook or Instagram, or just a lot of nonsense social media stuff. But nonetheless, we are always connected to some kind of hive mind that is the internet. So it's safe to say that, you know, in the future it's gonna be increasing at a much higher rate, that the machines are going to be integrated with our personal lives.
Seems that way, yeah.
So there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence and AI and super AI, and whether or not they will have a form of consciousness. So it's very interesting that you're here, because you have a PhD topic in Panpsychism, but we are also encountering this new problem, if you want to call it that is AI and the machines. So do you think that we're going to ultimately merge with the machines? And do you think the machines are going to have consciousness or sentient? Because I think Ray Kurzweil said that it's just a matter of time before we merge our consciousness or shift our consciousness into the brain of AI, because we don't even need to know how the inner workings of the brain. Really, we don't need to know every little detail of how the brain works in order to transfer consciousness, because what he thinks is that consciousness is not local in the brain, but it is somewhere you're tapping into, and it's some sort of a stream that the brain is receiving or exporting transmissions to. So, in other words, you can create a new form of consciousness in the AI, and then you can tap into that. So, what is your take on that?
Well, the first thing I'll say is this. If you believe that computers or robots or AI is possible, then you're immediately saying that consciousness is not restricted to a brain, and that makes panpsychism all the more plausible once again. Mm-hmm. Against those people who say, the mind is the brain, for a start. Secondly, there's a lot of talk about this. In philosophy, there's something called transhumanism, which is a new movement, really, which is the notion that it's, in a way, a new form of eugenics. So it's pushing the development of humanity into more complex forms, mostly through the use of technology, as you say. So, conceivably, soon our smartphones will be implanted within our bodies, and we'll have direct access to it, by simply thinking about it, perhaps. Direct access, that is, to the internet or whatever takes its place. I think that technology, in a way, you can say that technology has always been part and parcel of the human species. If you think about, the simple flint tools we once used and whatever, that's a form of technology. It's just become more and more advanced as time goes by. And it's not just humans, of course, but, for example, birds use technology in terms of twigs, nests. This is an artificial thing they have created. In one sense, you can see technology as completely natural, in the same sense that a bird's nest is completely natural. It's just using the environment for your own sake once more. Next question is AI possible? I think that one of the greatest mysteries we still face is how consciousness and matter are related. I mean, okay, I take a panpsychist view, but the question still remains as to the relationship of the abstraction between mind and matter. And so without knowing this relation, the mind-matter, or the world-not, as Schopenhauer calls it, the mind-matter relation, I think it's only speculation that we can reform consciousness in a machine sense. I'm not denying it. I think it probably is possible. But one danger I see is this, that when we look at the brain even, we might extract all the information on the neurological level. So in other words, how neurons are transmitting chemicals to one another and how they are pulsating in tandem and whatnot. We can take that information from our brain, we can transfer that to a computer, and then we can hope that consciousness will somehow emerge from that. But it could very well be the fact that is only a partial explanation of what's really going on in the brain. So you might have to look at every single individual neuron, for instance, is very, very complicated. And I think human brains have about 80 billion of those, and even more connections between them. So I don't think we're at a stage yet where we can take away how a brain works. We don't know how a brain works really at all. Well, we do to a certain extent, but not to full extent. And then transfer that simply into a computer. I don't think that's going to happen. But you mentioned that the consciousness might be sort of received by a brain, and therefore a computer could receive it as well. I mean, in a sense, at least in terms of memory, that's what Henri Bergson believed. I think that's partially true, but I'm undecided on the matter, really.
So what do you think about...
The danger is, though, believing that intelligence is the same thing as consciousness. So it's called artificial intelligence, and already that's sort of biasing our view upon it, because my Mac computer here is very intelligent. It can work things out and do things that I can't do, but that doesn't mean it's conscious in any way. So just because you have a very intelligent machine does not in any way mean that it's conscious. And even if that intelligence can simulate consciousness, so if we have a sort of a robot which even looks like a human and talks like a human and reacts like a human and so on, that could simply be a simulation of a human being, and there could be no total consciousness within it. Now, as a panpsychist, of course, I would say that what it's made of, there are forms of sentience within it, but it doesn't have that overall sense of self or that consciousness like a human has.
That's a very good point, and that's very interesting. And I always thought that maybe the humanoid AI that we see in the movies are just a portrayal of Hollywood, and that sells tickets because that scares us, and we'll buy tickets to see how that would take over the world, like Terminator style. But I think there's a different form of AI that could exist in the form of a giant server that connects a bunch of our machines to its central base, creating a hive mind, knowing where we are exactly and our blood pressure and things like that. And when they have that information, they can accurately predict the future, creating some kind of crystal ball in a way, because they have all of our information, all of our patterns, and when they can create an algorithm, then they can create and predict the future quite accurately. So I think that's most likely the case. I don't think an artificial intelligence robot would come in a form of a human shape, because it's really an inefficient way of doing things. And if you really look at it, we have evolved from monkeys. So I don't think that artificial intelligence will take a form of a monkey body to represent its intelligence and existence.
No, not if it, especially if it can self-develop eventually. I'll say this about the being able to determine the future and create an algorithm for it. I mean, of course, that depends on whether or not there do exist constants of nature, laws of nature that are true for all time. And of course, again, this is part of the modern scientific worldview. But there are many physicists even who now question that. So we think, for example, the speed of light is constant. I mean, there's even the letter C, as Einstein had it, for constant. But as Whitehead said, and David Hume even speculated, such laws of nature might be mere regularities of nature. So what we've seen through 100 or 200 years or whatever might just be part of a larger wave of fluctuation. So perhaps the speed of light, changes over time, or the laws of thermodynamics and whatever. It has not been. David Hume's point is this: you can't actually prove that the laws of nature are constant because you can't see the future. You don't know that the next day will be the same as the day before. So that's an assumption. And if the laws of nature do fluctuate, oscillate, then of course you can't create an algorithm that will predict the future perfectly. Number one. Number two, if you believe, as we were discussing before, if you believe in mental causation, which is not exactly the same thing as free will, if you believe that reason has power, like your reasoning actually has power to change your behavior and so on, then of course there is another force to nature, which it would be very difficult for an algorithm to put in place, again, to be able to predict the future. And in fact, if we're talking about real artificial sentience as opposed to artificial intelligence, then one would presume that form of sentience, whatever form it may take, if it takes its hive mind, as you say, will have a form of this mental causation. So it will be able to decide to do things which will go beyond its original programming, let's say, or code, or whatever you call it. So again, I'm not denying the possibility of artificial sentience, but what form it will take, I think, is very, very unpredictable. Another thing is this: how would you be able to tell that a computer, or whatever we may call these forms in the future, how would you actually be able to tell that it was sentient rather than simply appearing to be sentient? This is a question.
That's a really hard question to answer, right? I mean, because there's no way to determine that it has sentience or not. I mean,
and if you think about it, that's another limitation of the scientific worldview, because it doesn't matter how much you test it physically or make predictions upon that, it still would not give a definitive answer to that question. But in philosophy, this is called the problem of other minds. Ultimately, it's part of that.
But since it is natural, being that it was created by human beings, and human beings are natural to the earth, then isn't artificial intelligence or these robots, in a sense, natural itself and does have sentience?
Well, like I say, if you consider technology to be natural, in other words, therefore everything is natural, and this is what I believe, even jet fighters, cars and whatever, then yeah, you could say it's natural. But, we would then say, like, for example, a car is natural. That doesn't mean it's sentient, of course. So there's still, to get into a bit more detail with panpsychism, panpsychists, people often criticize them for saying, you believe that chairs and tables are conscious, how absurd. Most modern panpsychists don't say that. They will say that only self-organizing systems are sentient. So like the molecules within a chair, the molecules within a table are sentient, but the overall chair hasn't got a universal form of sentience. In other words, like, I am a chair. And the same applies to machines then. So, of course, parts of a machine, like the parts of a chair, are sentient and they operate in mechanical ways. But that doesn't mean that it has an overall sentience. Now, I suppose the key question, the key sort of aim for artificial intelligence advocates is the question of how we create a machine that is not only integrated physically but also integrated then mentally, creating a sort of unified mind. And it seems to me that our current state of knowledge, our current state of physics, biology, and whatever, is not up to that task yet. We can't the whole question of the mind and consciousness is a big mystery to the sciences. So we're just not. I just don't think we're in a. It's a bit like it's 500 years ago we would not be in the right state to think about how we could create a machine to go to the moon. We just didn't have the things in place at that time to be able to create a rocket. And today, and that's not because the raw materials didn't exist. It's rather because our way of thinking about these matters was not in place, was not advanced enough. I think the same for today. We can speculate about these conscious machines, but I don't think we certainly cannot knowingly create them yet.
So
if we do, it would be accidental, and we still would spend centuries working out how we did that, or how they're conscious.
So where does it end and where does it begin in regards to sentience? Because when you're born, I'm assuming that there is sentience there, and when you die, is it just gone? And the same thing applies to inanimate objects. Like, where does it end? Where does it begin? How do you define something that has sentience or not?
Two things I'll say about that. First of all, with it, it's interesting when you talk about an emerging embryo into a baby, because it seems very hard to suddenly say, the zygote is completely unconscious and the young embryo is completely unconscious, and then at one point, boom, consciousness emerges. Now, you might say, but it gradually emerges. But actually, the distinction between being able to describe something purely in the third person, purely spatio-temporally, like this embryo is this shape or whatever, to that point where it suddenly has a feeling of, let's say, some kind of basic thirst, maybe, or not thirst, or whatever it may be, is a radical jump, So again, it seems much more plausible that sentience was right there from the beginning, and that only its complexity emerges. It doesn't emerge out of nothing. There is no brute emergence there. Something that Saul Wright wrote about, the geneticist who was also a panpsychist. Where does it begin and end? This is a complicated question. I mean, I think I was talking about sort of a universal sentience for a machine. Ultimately, I think it's if we see a physical system and we see that as autopoietic, which means partly self-sustaining, then I think we can attribute a sort of group sentience to that, or a universal sentience to that system. Let's say like a cell has a certain, self-sustaining nature. A molecule does as well, an atom does. A chair does not. So I would not attribute sentience to a chair. That, though, is a very, very complicated question, something I'm looking at the moment in my PhD. Where it ends, and this is the big question, isn't it? Is there an afterlife? I would say that, I don't know. I don't think anyone knows the answer to this question, of course, but I would suspect that on our physical death, our unified point of view again is lost, but the sentience which made that up is not lost. It continues, it dissipates into smaller forms, and then that can reform again, just as matter can. But the question of life after death is not one I can answer.
So in a Christian context, in a biblical context, I'm not a Christian in any shape or form, but when they talk about God or Jesus, they will say that God and Jesus, they're everywhere. They exist in every object, in every drop of water. And of course, when you take psychedelics, at a point you will come into that same conclusion and realize that there is God or soul, whatever name you want to put on it, in everything. Because when you're touching things, when you're looking at things, you'll recognize that it has some sort of intelligence. I don't want to use that word, but that's the only word that I can come up with other than sentience. So is that what they're talking about, really? Can a Christian person call the same thing as God or soul or spirit or whatever label you want to put on it?
Well, I mean, yeah, difficult. William James.
Because there's an essence in everything, right? Because when your senses are heightened on psychedelics, or when you're experiencing some transcendental religious bliss, where you're very open to the outside world, so to speak, you recognize that there is something there. There is something like this desk or this chair is more than what it is. It's not just this dualistic dead or alive thing.
Yeah, okay. I mean, yeah, I think what's happened is Christianity and most known religions have reached a point where people, really find them hard to believe in their original forms. That Jesus rose from the dead, and you're born a sinner, as Catholics have it, and you must atone for your sins, and all the miracles, walking on water and whatever. This just seems completely implausible. However, as you are suggesting, there does seem to be a metaphysical need within humans, by which I mean is what Schopenhauer said, and by which he means that just looking at the world and our ordinary consciousness and our sober consciousness and going about with our lives seems to be insufficient. It doesn't satiate a certain need we have, a need beyond what Darwinian theory can explain, need for reproduction, hunger, whatever. And I think that a lot of people, if they're not brought up that way, they become religious to satiate that need then. And the interesting thing about psychedelics is that it really brings that, I wouldn't say need, it brings that aspect of life, of our reality. It highlights that, it brings it to the front. So as you say, on psychedelics, especially I think with nature, you go out in nature, or even you look at a pot plant, whatever, and the sort of the beauty, not only the beauty, but the sort of aesthetics of such things, like a simple leaf, and their relation to the rest of reality is felt. It's not only intellectually thought, it's a sort of direct intuition of what seems to be the significance of reality, the real significance of reality, which in everyday life we become blind to because we're too focused on practical needs. I suppose it's a mystic's life or a hermit's life to sort of get away from everyday reality, to focus on these things through meditation, prayer, and whatever. I do think that psychedelics are a sort of quick way to appreciate that broader significance of reality, a value-laden reality. So again, bringing Whitehead here, we, as a result mostly of Descartes, we think that the nature is purely mechanical, you can explain it in spatio-temporal terms alone. Well, Whitehead says, no, that omits too much of what is actually out there. Values, subjective values, exist in nature from the start, and we eliminate, our perception of nature often eliminates that aspect of reality. I think that psychedelics reintroduces you to that value-laden significance, and that's why I think psychedelics have a profound effect on many people, because they suddenly can show people really that there's so much more to reality than the really limited consciousness we generally have of it, which of course is a consciousness that we have evolved for practical needs. No doubt other animals have evolved different forms of consciousness to meet the needs they find themselves having in whatever environment they've evolved through. So again, like a cuttlefish, no doubt has a consciousness distinct from ours. But nonetheless, that cuttlefish consciousness is very limited. I think ours, although it's complex, is still very limited. I think that we have a metaphysical need, and I think now psychedelics bring out that metaphysical need, or at least they quench it much better than Christianity or the other religions can do. I think the sort of metaphysical aspect of most religions is lost. They were probably there in the beginning, and that was probably why they formed. But through the years, through the centuries and millennia, they've lost that element, mostly, not always, but mostly. So in a way, you can see psychedelia as a new. I would definitely not say new religion, because then immediately you get groupthink and whatever, and dogmas which occur and manifestos and whatever. But certainly they are a reintroduction of the metaphysical into our lives.
Do you think there's a synergistic link between philosophy and psychedelic drug use?
Well, my personal mission is to say, there's so much psychedelics offers philosophy, which we've sort of which hasn't been looked at. Just so, especially when you consider that a major component of philosophy today is philosophy of mind. For philosophers of mind not to have taken psychedelics is a bit like music students not to have played an instrument. It's just, you're just really missing out on such a fundamental part of the mind there, and reality itself. So, I've written a number of articles about the interrelationship between philosophy and psychedelics in terms of panpsychism, but also in terms of Platonism, in terms of nihilism even. And I think there's a lot more to be said about, a hell of a lot more. In fact, I think it's actually it can be, hopefully it will be, an emerging form of philosophy, psychedelic philosophy. I think that is to come. I also think it has links, like I say, not only in philosophy of mind, but also in transhumanism. When you consider the fact that nootropics, smart drugs and whatever, is an aspect of transhumanism. How do we evolve ourselves and so on? Then, if you think that microdosing, for example, with psychedelics, if that actually works, and rather than being a placebo, I think there's a whole new aspect of that there. In fact, there was this Nietzschean commentator, an English one, called A.R. Orage, who wrote about Nietzsche's Superman, Overman, this next form of humanity, or the step away from humanity, really. And he said in the early 20th century that this would require new forms of consciousness, this new step in the evolution of man. And so, with regard to that, you can say that psychedelics not only give you this new view upon reality, but also they might be an essential tool in the evolution of man.
That's very interesting. Do you think that when somebody is trying to study the mind and philosophy of the mind, and whenever you're taking psychedelics, you're able to step outside of the mind for that period of time and be studying it from an outside perspective, kind of like an astronaut studying Earth from space and seeing it as a whole, rather than being inside the Earth the whole time, where you can only get a certain limited amount of information. But when you're zooming out and looking at it from a macro level, you're able to see really what's going on and the processes that the brain and your thoughts are taking. Do you believe that to be true? That's what I suppose. That's why Jung coined the term psychonaut, because it has that sort of analogy to being an astronaut. You certainly take an outside view of your life. You look at the social structures in which we live, and you question that. And the old stories of how psychedelics have even inspired scientific insights and creative possibilities and so on and so forth. There's an essay I wrote called Antichrist Psychonaut about Nietzsche's use of drugs. He was a prolific drug user, not the traditional psychedelics, of course, but opium, for example, and chloral hydrate, and these have psychedelic properties. And I think that even this great philosopher himself was inspired by his drug use. And so if that inspired Nietzsche, who was one of the most creative thinkers that ever existed, then just think about the possibilities on thinkers of the future and today. What insights could be gained from, as you say, extracting yourself from society, from everyday life. It seems to have a lot of potential there. And
as
also,
I say.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So I'm also wondering, like, which other new psychedelic drugs we'll be able to discover in the future, because Albert Hoffman discovered LSD accidentally, but before that, there was no such thing as LSD in our world. There was other psychedelic drugs that were similar to that, but not LSD in itself. So I'm wondering if there are any other new psychedelics that have been found that has not been reported yet, or has yet to be found in a lab where our future human beings will be working on, and those psychedelics would generate new types of insights and philosophies in the mind. And I think that's very interesting, because I don't think we have found every combination of chemicals on this universe to produce all the psychedelic drugs that is known to humanity. I think there's still a lot of room and opportunities for new psychedelics to be born and made and transcend us into new areas of the mind that we've never thought about before.
Yeah, no, absolutely. A very exciting possibility. I mean, if you think about like William James, who wrote about psychedelics to some extent 100 years ago, for example, in the Varieties of Religious Experience, he's talking about ether, nitrous oxide, and so on. And then mescaline comes in later. In other thinkers, now we have, as you say, LSD, DMT, psilocybin, or whatever. I mean, of course, the Mexicans had psilocybin for centuries, if not millennia. But in the West here, I think that if you consider all the so-called legal highs being produced at the moment, I mean, this is sure to throw up a few very exciting new chemicals. Or in tandem with that, of course, the value of neuroscience and these LSD studies is that we are beginning to realize the mechanisms of how LSDs work on the mind. Now, of course, I'm not saying that the brain produces the mind totally, but nonetheless, it's very, very useful to know. Like, for example, they've recently discovered that LSD works as it does partly because it creates a cap on its intersection with the neuron. So with that advancement in our knowledge of how the brain works and how certain molecules react with the brain, we can perhaps use that knowledge then to create new, as you say, new chemicals which we at least will know will have certain cascading effects on the brain objectively. But then the interesting question becomes, and what would the subjective correlate of that be? There could be chemicals which we couldn't even imagine now. And also in parallel with that, as we were talking about transhumanism, consider the fact that if we have technological implants in the future, let's say in a few decades, in the brain itself, then how will chemicals such as LSD or whatever react with that? In fact, furthermore, instead of a molecule, could we simply have technology that blocks certain parts of brain functioning in order to allow a psychedelic experience to occur? These are all unanswered questions, but the future is bright.
Do you think there's an evolutionary advantage to having psychedelic experiences? Because in every culture, there are ways to induce these experiences on demand, whether it's through endogenous drugs or through pain or through rituals. Every ancient culture that we have had ways to control these transcendental experiences whenever they want to. So it seems like this is a big part of our human experience and played a big part of our human evolution as a species, as a culture. So do you think that there's any advantage to having those peak experiences?
The first thing I'd say is that we have evolved the ordinary forms of consciousness that we have for evolutionary reasons. In other words, we've limited ourselves to practicalities, generally speaking, So there's an evolutionary advantage to having a limited form of consciousness. That's what I'd say, first of all. Secondly, though, as you say, most cultures have this, many cultures at least have this recourse to losing yourself, through psychedelics, for example, or through chanting, rituals, fasting, whatever, meditation. Does that itself serve an evolutionary purpose? Well, I'm suggesting that it can do. Like I say, in transhumanism, psychedelics can help form a new form of consciousness, which will push us to the next level of evolution. It can do, but has it already? I mean, Terence McKenna has got this theory about how psychedelics created consciousness. These things are impossible to prove, but it's an interesting idea. I don't think it's true. I do think, though, that psychedelics are important for us because they allow for this quenching of the metaphysical thirst that we have. It's a bit like alcohol, although it's sort of dangerous. If we didn't drink it to a certain extent, we might die of boredom. I think, especially in England where I live here, or Britain.
I was about to say.
Yeah, people have got, there are all these sort of unwritten rules of courtesy and whatever, and it sometimes becomes, too much. So that's probably why the English are big drinkers, because it allows for that escape from their very from their particular form of culture. So alcohol, William James said alcohol is being drunk is the first stage of the mystical consciousness, So I'm not against alcohol. A lot of people in psychedelic circles are against alcohol, but for LSD or whatever, I'm for both. I think alcohol certainly allows for this escape from our ordinary consciousness, and likewise, if you want to take a further step away, then you would take psilocybin or whatever it may be. So I think that plays an evolutionary role, at least insofar as it keeps us sane. We need these forms of escape quite often.
So you mentioned earlier that we have an advantage evolutionarily with limited consciousness. What do you mean by that?
Something that Henri Bergson wrote about. Henri Bergson was mentioned by Aldous Huxley in The Doors of Perception, for example, with his valve theory. What I mean by that is the following. If, let's say, we were always looked at nature in the way we spoke about. So we came across a leaf in a garden, and we just gazed at that for an hour. We were just overawed by its beauty and its significance to the universe as a whole, and so on, as can often happen at psychedelic experiences. If that was our everyday form of consciousness, we would soon be, devoured by wolves or whatever, by some enemy, or we wouldn't be able to go hunting or foraging for food. So we'd die of hunger. So it's not useful for us to be awestruck all the time. So therefore, it's much more, even though that value-laden reality might be real, it's much more, it's much more important in terms of survival to ignore that. And so it seems that our consciousness, though complex, is abstract in the sense that we only perceive that which is of use to us in terms, ultimately, I would say, of power, being a Nietzschean, but at least in terms of survival and reproduction. So, we see, of the electromagnetic spectrum, we only see a tiny fraction of that. The colors we see in the rainbow. But of course, other animals like bees, deer see ultraviolet and so on. We don't see ultraviolet because it served no evolutionary advantage to us, though it did for bees, being able to see more within flowers and whatever. So we know that our perception is limited in terms of electromagnetism. The question then becomes, can we increase? You can increase your consciousness. I think even something so simple as increasing your vocabulary increases your consciousness in the sense that with new words, with new subtle divisions between something that you would have before considered to be one same concept, you suddenly see more in the world. And this can be overbearing to some people. So again, the next step in our evolution, I think, would entail us being able to take in more of reality while still realizing that we must survive. reproduce. So again, this would be the next step. We're not there yet.
So
psychedelics certainly give us a sort of indication of something that is possible. But at the moment, you can't. It's hard to take psychedelics and be at least a large dose of psychedelics and be functioning in the world.
Right. So in another sense, you're implying that when you're on psychedelics, you're kind of opening the doors of perception to all the beauties of the world, and you're just awed by what's happening around you and the thoughts that are coming into your head and the imagery, and you're in a way really upgrading your consciousness. But like you said earlier, when you learn about new vocabulary and new words, you can sort of upgrade and your consciousness, and that brings the question, well, how can you even measure consciousness? Because is it something that's measurable, or is it something that you just have and it fluctuates and oscillates? But what exactly are we talking about here?
I mean, this is a massive question that phenomenology deals with. You know, what are the aspects of consciousness? We can divide it in so many different ways. We can talk about, sort of degree of wakefulness or degree of sleepfulness. We talk about, we can talk about high consciousness in terms of being very focused upon a particular problem, or we can talk about it as being completely unfocused and ambiguous. But also there's another high form of consciousness, which is, for example, psychedelic experience, which is completely distinct from being focused upon a problem. But that's also another, as I say, high complex form of consciousness. So there are just so many facets to it. And on top of those forms of consciousness, there is this other aspect, which is the following, that the objects of our thoughts are not the same thing as our thoughts. So when I think about whiteness, for example, the color white, people like Bertrand Russell, Santayana, Whitehead, Plato ultimately say that whiteness itself is not consciousness, it's rather the object of consciousness. Now, that object itself is eternal, it's timeless, because many different people and creatures can perceive the same color, whiteness, whatever it may be. So therefore, that color can't be identical to any instance of it. Otherwise, one would not be seeing the same color. So you can go into a lot of detail with regard to that. But ultimately, you can end up in this universal realism, which means that there's another aspect of existence which is this eternal realm of mentality or forms or essences or universals. Now, if you believe this, then that I've recently had just published a new article about Whitehead and the psychedelic mode of perception, and I conjecture there that under the psychedelic experience you can access this eternal realm and perhaps perceive those types of mentality that are otherwise forbidden to you as a human practical creature. So in a way it can provide us with alien forms of mentality. You gain objects of experience which you would never do in your everyday life. That doesn't have much immediate practical significance, certainly not evolutionary significance, but nonetheless it can inspire people to look at new forms of consciousness and thus, as you say, manipulate the brain, manipulate technology so as to create new forms of intelligence. And again, the possibilities are endless.
Wow, that's really, really fascinating. And so you also wrote a book called Neo-Nihilism, and that book also inspired Marvel comic character Karnak. So
that's right.
Can you tell us more about that?
Okay. Well, I wrote a short text called Neo-Nihilism then, and I put it online for sale on Amazon a few years ago. It's now a chapter in my book, Numenautics. But it sells by itself as well. And it was really just a summary of my thoughts on morality, ethics, and how ultimately combining the figures of Hume, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche, I'm saying that there's no objective morality, no absolutes out there. There's only, like I say about laws of nature, fluctuating morals. This is nothing new, really. I think the new thing about it is the way I've put it and my emphases, and the style, the written style is very hyperbolic. But yeah, I wrote this. It's quite harsh. It's got a very harsh style. And strangely, it was picked up by this writer called Warren Ellis, who I discovered is this legendary comic books writer. He wrote Iron Man, Batman, the new James Bond graphic novels, and so on and so forth, movies as well as comics and whatever. And he wrote a review of it. Suddenly gave me a massive sales boost. And then I thanked him for that, and I thought, yeah, that's great. It's nice to be acknowledged. But then later on, Marvel asked him to recreate this character called Karnak that Stan Lee created a few decades ago. Karnak is a member of the Inhumans, which is this family of this royal family in the Marvel universe. They are a bit like, the Avengers, some group like this. They asked him to recreate the character, and he did so using the philosophy of Eugene Thacker, but also myself, especially neo-nihilism. And so after that, a lot more people were interested in seeing what it was all about. And now I see that Marvel have teamed up with ABC and IMAX cinemas to create a hybrid movie/TV show called The Inhumans. So the Karnak is one of a few characters there. Ken Leung, I think, has been cast as Karnak now. He was in Star Wars and Lost and some other shows, Rush Hour. And it's all very exciting. In fact, I'm about to meet a doctor of comic literature tomorrow at Exeter University to discuss this and other possible interactions between philosophy and comic book superheroes and transhumanism, and I will bring some psychedelics into it, So there's, again, a very interesting avenue to look at soon. This interaction between our general love for superheroes, especially high in these last 10 years, I'd say, and what philosophy and psychedelics can bring to that matter.
Wow, so they actually casted an Asian guy to be this character. They should have casted me. Hey, man.
Well, yeah, you should have thrown your hat on the table. I mean, I was surprised that he was an Asian guy, because in the comics he's not Asian, really.
Right.
But it sort of makes sense, because the original Karnak, I should say Karnak's superpower is that he finds the flaw in anything. So not only in physical structures or in human bodies, but also in philosophies and ideologies and whatever. That's his superpower. So he's just very, very smart, you could say. But also, he's a sort of martial artist. And originally, that was emphasized more, his martial arts expertise. So I suppose because, in the common mind, martial arts are associated with, East Asians. Casting an East Asian in that role, does make sense. I'm happy about it.
So I want to go back to neo-nihilism, because I want to make the distinction between what is just traditional good old nihilism, and then how does neo-nihilism differ from that?
Nihilism has a number of different meanings. There's a Russian movement of it and so on. And nihil in Latin means nothing, nothingness. So it's nothingnessism. There's two main varieties of that. There's the notion that there exist no objective facts and no objective values. And then there's the version that I use, which is that there do exist objective facts, but there do not exist objective values. And by objective values, what I mean is there's no absolute right and wrong way to live. And every time someone tells you, you should do this or you shouldn't do that, for example, you should lose your ego and you should help other people and so on, this is always a subjective imperative from those people. Ultimately, it's subconsciously a power act So when someone tells you that you should do something or you shouldn't do something, what they're ultimately doing is they're trying to impose their subjective preferences upon you. In other words, they're trying to overpower you. They might think that they might not realize that themselves. They might be unconscious of that fact. But nonetheless, my argument is that this is what they're doing. I take that mostly from Nietzsche, but also some 20th century thinkers such as C.L. Stevenson, C.L. Mackie, and so on. I also bring in, though, Schopenhauer, because there's this very important distinction which is mostly always lost when we talk about morality, the distinction between descriptive morals and prescriptive morals. By descriptive morals, I mean describing how people act in different societies and how they define morals, so like the Victorian women didn't want to show the flesh on their wrists or their legs or whatever. It was considered moral to show your legs, in public, in the Victorian age in Britain. Today we think that's absurd, but we've got other morals today which we think are absolute, and so on. And my point is that we are not progressing morally here; we're just changing. So in 50 years' time, we'll laugh at that as we laughed at Victorian mores.
Right. Do you think there's a realization of nihilism when you're taking psychedelics? Because that's something that I've experienced myself when I'm on psychedelics. I laugh at our moral values sometimes. And I even sometimes when I'm having a quote-unquote bad trip, I'm inclined to do things that are morally really wrong in our traditional standards. But under a psychedelic state, it doesn't seem wrong at all. As a matter of fact, it seems natural to do those things. But when I wake up from the trip or when I get sober again, I'll think back and I'll say to myself, holy shit, what were you thinking? So
so that's very interesting that you say that, actually. I'll ask you after the interview what that was in detail. Very interesting. A part of this is the following. There seems to be this growing psychedelic culture of which you're a part, of course, and from the so-called hippie age, there seems to be this link between psychedelic intake, and a kind of pacifist morality, a peaceful morality. Now, a lot of thinkers even say, when you take psychedelics, you become a pacifist, basically, and you want peace and harmony on the world, and so on. In fact, I think you interviewed Tim Scully, didn't you, recently? You did, because I heard the interview. I did as well, interestingly, in written form. And he was saying, it was quite interesting, wasn't it? Because he took this LSD, and he suddenly had a life goal to turn on everyone to LSD so that we can get rid of war and so on, and aggression. But then he was disillusioned pretty soon thereafter, because he realized these things did not have that effect on the world at all. And when you look at certain thinkers like Albert Hoffman's Albert Hoffman's close associate and friend, Ernst Jünger, this German philosopher, who a whole chapter in Albert Hoffman's book, LSD, My Problem Child, was devoted to Ernst Jünger. Ernst Jünger coined the term psychonaut. He took psychedelics. He thought they should not be given to the public, and Heidegger called him the last continuer of Nietzsche. I mean, he was, in that sense, a sort of nihilist, at least at one phase. The Nobel laureate Octavio Paz also wrote about how psychedelics extract you away from society to such an extent that, yes, they do extract you away from your morality as well. So in that sense, psychedelics can have the effect of instigating a nihilism upon a person. I mean, that would be a complete extraction from your social mores, not just political hierarchical structures, but more fundamentally than that. So I think there's this very interesting tie then between psychedelic intake and nihilism in that sense. I have written a little bit about it. I want to go into it more soon. And I think we should do away with this notion that, taking psychedelics is immediately going to leave you to this particular a liberal left-wing New Age ideological stance. I don't think that happened. I think that if you have that stance already and you take psychedelics, they might reinforce that stance. But someone who's neutral, I don't think they'll necessarily have that view. Although, like I say, they do have, I think it's probably quite universal that they have the effect of making a person more appreciative of nature and art and intellectual arts and so on.
Right.
But
So
in terms of morality, though, I think everything's open there. And I think really, if you've totally extracted yourself from society, you would extract yourself from that morality as well. Most people would probably say, oh, yeah, that's me, I've extracted myself from morality, but they'll still ultimately believe in certain axioms of morality. For example, that suffering is bad. I mean, we all obviously suffering is bad, right? Everyone will say. But under psychedelics, you can even question that, as did Nietzsche.
Right.
Not under psychedelics. Nietzsche questioned that alone.
It's interesting because there's a lot of people that are not willing to try psychedelics because they don't want themselves to turn into somebody that they wouldn't want to be. Rather, it's some love and light, loving hippie or something along those lines where they kind of look at that and cringe, and they don't want to take the mushroom because they are afraid that afterwards they would completely turn themselves around and quit their jobs and just kind of camp out in Woodstock and live a happy life. But what you're saying is that is not going to happen at all, because when you're taking psychedelics, you're just reinforcing your own ideologies and moralities and having a heavier imprint on them afterwards, instead of turning yourself into some sort of left-wing liberal war protesting hippie. Is that correct?
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I think it can have an effect. It can change a person's life around, and probably has, making, from a 9-to-5 office worker to someone who lives in a forest. I mean, extremely. But I think that can happen for a number of people. My point simply is that it needn't happen. It's not always going to happen. It can have an opposite effect upon other people, perhaps. I mean, I think, there are different forms of psychedelics. There are different forms of psychedelic experience. We really generalize when we talk about the psychedelic experience, of course. And how that interacts with each individual will vary greatly. My only point really is that psychedelics will not of necessity turn one into, as you say, one of these left-leaning New Age stereotypes.
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting because I sometimes post some political tweets on my Twitter, and somebody that follows me told me one time that you can't seriously think of yourself as a psychedelic thinker if you're supporting this policy, which I thought it was very interesting, because there's no point in psychedelics or psychedelia where you're supposed to follow some sort of political party or agenda or toe some specific party line in order to be considered a psychedelic thinker. And second of all, I don't even think I'm a psychedelic thinker. I'm just a guy with a podcast talking about these subjects. So I thought it was very interesting because there's a lot of people identifying themselves with psychedelics and also with that whole camp of left-wing liberalism. And as a matter of fact, doesn't really always go hand in hand. If you think about history, people have been taking psychedelics for a long time, but are they all left-wing liberals? I wouldn't think so. I would argue against that. So
yeah, exactly. This is the danger, like I said before, of turning psychedelia into a religion. Then you get a dogma. When someone says, "Oh no, you shouldn't think that way," I mean, that's a dogmatism, which it would be nice to think psychedelics can take you away from. Any form of dogmatism like that.
Right.
But it happens. I mean, there's this great group-forming mentality. People want to be part of a group, a movement, a school of thought or something, to feel like they're protected somehow. But the thing that psychedelics can do is completely open your mind up to an infinitude of possibilities. So yeah, I don't like this moralizing at all.
Is there a link between nihilism and the quote-unquote bad trips of psychedelics? Because again, these bad trips are really interpreted very subjectively by the people that have been taking those psychedelics, because what determines a good trip and a bad trip ultimately is really up to the user. But I mean, who determines what is good, what is bad is really subjective. But for the sake of this conversation, do you think that there's a link between nihilism and the darker side of psychedelics?
Yes. For instance, if you do have an experience of emancipation from moral customs, then afterwards you can look back at that, believing that your social moral customs are right, objective, and think, what a terrible trip this was to dissuade me from this truth. So, in retrospect, of course, you could then call that a bad trip, as it were. Of course, you needn't say that. I mean, I wouldn't say that, of course. Secondly, with regard to so-called bad trips, I mean, there are dark trips, not necessarily a bad trip. By dark, I mean, the gothic type trips that you have of demons and skulls and hell and whatever, which I find fascinating and I hope happens. But of course, for a lot of people, that is a bad trip and terrifying, especially, again, if you've got these background beliefs of, let's say you brought up a Christian, you might think, okay, here's proof of hell, something like that, detrimental effect on you that way. With regard to nihilism generally, I think that if you can value a trip which is dark, then you're already saying that there exists these values that are not traditional, at least not in our Western culture. And if you can appreciate those, then of course you are expanding your value system, I should say. But this is something I'm going to write about in detail later. I haven't formulated my thoughts on it fully yet.
So you mentioned earlier that you actually welcome the dark trips, meaning the skulls and the demons and stuff like that. So why is that? Well,
I just think number one, I mentioned this to someone last week, that it's just fascinating that humans have this propensity to sort of scare themselves, I mean, nightmares is a basic version of that, but also the dark trips, which seem very common. Why does that happen in the first place, even to people who have no interest in the Gothic or terror or horror or anything like this? Why is this so prevalent, number one? Number two, I'm interested in it because it's just aesthetically appealing to me. I love Gothic architecture and so on, and occult symbolisms and whatnot. So I just see a huge aesthetic value in that as well. Thirdly, of course, there's this much more speculative question as to the veridicality of other beings you might meet in your psychedelic experience. Now, I'm agnostic about that. I'm not saying that you actually meet other entities that have their own sentience. But if those entities are common, in other words, if you see them a number of times repeatedly, then that does instill a certain objectivity there, which you can then consider. I mean, considering the fact that I don't believe that physicality is the essential aspect of reality, but only one aspect of it, when you consider that, you become much more open-minded to the possibility of other realities, other sentient realities as well.
Do you think there are sentience or consciousness or even awareness in those entities that you're seeing under psychedelics, the ones that appear over and over again?
I doubt it, to be honest, but I'm open-minded about it. I'm agnostic about it ultimately. But there are parts, like I say, we don't know the relationship between the mind and the brain. We don't know the relationship between the mind and this universal realm of eternal forms, if that exists. That's debatable as well. We're really beginners with all of this. So when something occurs in consciousness, especially something that frequently occurs, one should remain open-minded about possibilities, I think. So I'm not closing down the debate. I mean, it's a bit like Kurt Gödel, the great mathematician logician who came up with the incompleteness theorems, which relates to AI as well, I should say. He believed that the mathematical and logical objects he was considering actually existed. I mean, apart from him, he was discovering these logical results or these mathematical objects. He wasn't inventing them. They were already out there, as it were. But they had an atemporal, non-physical existence. In fact, he wrote that without this modern form of Platonism or this universal realism, he would not have come up with the incompleteness theorems. Now, I think there's a lot of mathematicians and logicians believe in this eternal realm, and a number of philosophers as well, from Plato, as I say, actually from Pythagoras. If you accept that, that reality is more than the physical around you and the mental that you see it through, then all options are open. But like I say, I don't know.
That's a great answer. So how do we?
Ultimately, none of us know anything really.
Right. The more you find out, the less we actually know.
Exactly. The more you find out, the more you realize you don't know anything, as Socrates famously said, or Shakespeare. The wise man knows that he is a fool, something like this.
So this is a question that I've been wondering since I was a little kid, and I sometimes wonder why I questioned this when I was a child, because this is a really deep question. And how do we actually know that what we're experiencing, the reality that we're experiencing, is the same reality that you're also experiencing? Meaning, if I'm meeting with you in person and we're at a cafe and we're having coffee and we're talking about this subject, how do I know that you are indeed looking at me and you're not just a figment of my imagination that I've imagined to be, and this world as I know it is all formed by my mind and my imagination and thoughts, and not this parallel reality that we're coexisting on?
Well, in philosophy, this problem is known as solipsism. Descartes, famously had this idea: how do we know that an evil genius demon is not tricking us, like in the Matrix, as we have it today? Well, my response to it is this: that solipsism assumes representationalism. Representationalism is the view that we represent the world we see around us in our minds. So in other words, everything we see around us is like a copy of what's actually out there. So in other words, the light hits a table, that electromagnetism hits our eyes, goes into our brain, and somehow a representation of the table emerges out of that brain. Of course, this emergence is the magic which materialism cannot explain. Now, if you believe in that representationalism, that we represent reality rather than perceiving it directly, which is the common view, then you end up in solipsism. My view out of that is through Whitehead and Bergson, and it's this: that representationalism is false. When we perceive something, that perception is actually part of that thing. It's a part of that thing. It's not the whole thing. So there's no real distinction between the object and the subject. And thus, everything we see normally is a direct touching, as it were, of what's actually out there. And because Whitehead's a process philosopher, he doesn't believe that there are things and subjects, or subjects and objects, but rather everything is a process. The process, ultimately, that is the table, is part and parcel of the process that is your body and the activity of your body within your brain. It's just one continual process. So in that sense, consciousness extends beyond your brain to your environment. And only by assuming this, what is known as vectorization, can you overcome this issue that you say of solipsism. Schopenhauer, though, he was a representationalist, and he said solipsism is like a citadel or a fort in a battle. You can't break it down, but you can just move on past it. In other words, you assume it's not true, and then you get on with other things.
Right. And there's also these are the things that are really hard to think about, because we are studying consciousness and the mind, but it's also really hard to study with our point of view. That is, we are existing in this awareness. And when you are in awareness itself, it's hard to study awareness. So I think these subjects are really interesting, but at the same time, really impossible to fully grasp the true understanding of it, because we are so deeply involved with consciousness itself. So,
yes. And like we were saying, our consciousness is limited because of evolution. I often say to my students that our perspective upon reality is a bit like a bee flying over a game of chess. It can see all the pieces, but it has absolutely no idea that it's a game, or that there are moves or tactics that can be had, and so on. So we see the world around us, well, we only see part of it, but we have very little idea of how it all fits together.
And also, we're very limited by our language. And one of the obvious signs is when you're taking psychedelics and you come back into this reality and you're trying to describe all those things, but you just don't have the vocabulary to define your experience. And we know that there's so much potential to our language that can describe certain phenomenon that we have an impossible way to describe so far. So I think, like you mentioned earlier, if we expanded our vocabulary, it would make tremendous progress. But
it's a good point, isn't it? Because I think fellow psychonauts will probably be able to have an expanded vocabulary at some point, where we can talk about certain shared experiences that are beyond ordinary consciousness, but then we talk about them and then we can give them a name, and thus our vocabulary increases to match our increased conceptualization of reality.
But don't you think that once you give something a name, it kind of loses its eternal essence?
Certainly. I mean, a name is, of course, real generalized. Every single word is a generalization, of course, but at least we can talk about, oh yes, this happened again, or something like that. It just aids communication, but of course the language alone could never convey the experience itself.
Right. Yeah, that's a very
that's a general point. I mean, even looking at the ocean or something from the cliffs during a storm, it can be very sublime, epic, and whatever. And you can later on, a week later, put that in words in a poem or something, but it will never fully convey the experience.
Yeah, that's a great point. So you also wrote a new book called Pneumatics, and it combines metaphysics, metaethics, and psychedelics. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it is about, and what are your inspirations for this work?
Okay, well, it's a collection of essays, so you don't have to read it from start to finish. It contains the text Neo-Nihilism in the middle, as I say. But it also contains essays about my first forays into psychedelia, from teaching about religious experience to finding mushrooms and so on. And there's one essay about how, the shock of it all, especially to someone who's studied philosophy of mind and whatever. So it's there's an essay about Nietzsche's drug use and how it might have inspired his philosophy, and other essays about Nietzsche and Schopenhauer morality. But I think the sort of novelty of it really is that it introduces people. Hopefully, my sort of aim is that it makes people realize how much philosophy has to say about the psychedelic experience, and how we shouldn't treat psychedelic experience as some kind of recreation, something unimportant, just something to laugh about, but as a serious topic, much as we speak about music seriously or poetry seriously. But I think it's even more serious than that. So I'm just trying to make psychedelics a sort of more respectable academic field.
Do you believe that one has to have a peak experience with ego death or transcendence of space-time, basically an epic time whenever you're taking psychedelics, in order to come to a philosophical realization that you might have? Or can somebody take psychedelics at, let's say, a party setting, a miniature dose, and still come to the same conclusions?
I doubt the latter. Really, I think you need really to have had heavy doses to. I mean, not necessarily, but of course, the deeper experiences you have, the more you have to talk about, and the more alien to everyday reality those experiences are. So, so I would say, really, you need to have gone into the deep ocean in order to talk about it.
So how do you cope with our society today? Because obviously you're a very deep thinker, you're a very intelligent guy, and you've had a lot of psychedelic experiences. And one of the challenges that I go through is that whenever I have a profound experience on psychedelics, it's hard to integrate back into the society that we're supposed to operate on today because, like you said earlier, our morals, our ethics, they are aligned to the current culture of today. But when you're taking psychedelics, you're extracting yourself from that, and all of a sudden, when you're sober again, you're supposed to fit back into those molds, those slots, those boxes that you're supposed to be in society today. So how do you integrate back into today's world?
Yeah, that's well, okay. I suppose I'd say this, that when I first read Nietzsche, that ripped me away from my world to start with. When I was sort of 18, 19, and it's very hard to get back into reality, having gleaned the points he makes. Then becoming a panpsychist, that takes you away from everyday life as well. Everyday belief, and then on top of that, psychedelic stuff. So I've got sort of three main issues where I differ from most people.
You're supposed to be living in a forest, right? not in London.
Yeah. Well, I'm not in London anymore. I'm now in Cornwall by the sea, the southwest version. But I did live in London for 10 years, yeah. But, okay, how do I deal with that? Well, with regard to ethics, I generally have to break up your levels of conversation to match the person or the group you're speaking to. And I think that's almost like an art form. You can learn social skills. And at this point in my life, I learned to not talk about certain things to certain people because they'll either get bored or they'll get a negative impression, or not that if I cared about that. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. So you just limit yourself sometimes. And I think with psychedelics, that's very difficult, especially when you first come across them, because as you know, the experience can be so incredibly awe-inspiring. Like you've just traveled through space to different solar systems or whatever. You just want to tell everyone, you won't believe, what I've just seen. But eventually you learn to sort of to keep that within circles, for people who are interested in it. I must say this though, most people I've come across are very, very interested in psychedelic experience. Because it's just it's intrinsically fascinating. Like at university, for example, when I tell other philosophy professors about it, they are fascinated, asking me questions about it, but they're still sort of scared mostly to try them, because of misinformation mostly about their dangers and so on. But yeah, so how do I deal with it? Well, I generally can't speak about ethics to someone who hasn't read Nietzsche. I mean, it sounds very pompous, but that's just the way it is. I can speak to psychedelics to people who are generally thoughtful people. People who are interested in matters of the mind or matters of culture, politics, even. But you have to create a sort of level, an orderly system of levels of topical, debatable subject, I suppose.
Yeah. Wow. So this has been an amazing episode. I really enjoyed it, and I think there needs to be more people like yourself, legit philosophers out there that are talking about psychedelics and how it influenced them, and even the philosophy of psychedelics. I think that's very interesting. There's a lot of people out there right now that call themselves futurists or things like that. But really what they're doing is they're throwing a lot of big words around, and they're trying to link, these fancy words and nouns and adjectives, and it makes them sound really intelligent, but in reality is that they're really just throwing on these word salads to impress people that really don't know what they're listening to. But I think you're one of those people that are very legit. You have an amazing background in philosophy, and you can pull up any philosophical theory just from your brain and reference them in real time. And I think this is an amazing thing to do, because not only do you have your own thoughts, but you can also look back into history and say what other people thought about this certain subject, instead of just kind of freestyle on the spot. So I think, man, this is an amazing interview, I think, and I really enjoyed your work. And
well, thank you. I appreciate it. I mean, it's actually the longest interview I've ever done, I think.
That's great.
I really enjoyed it. Yeah, I lost myself in time there.
Yeah, so how can people find you and learn more about your work and stuff?
Well, my website is www.philosopher.eu. I've got social media profiles. On Twitter, I'm at Peter Sjöstedt-H. Sjöstedt is spelled Sjöstedt. I've got a Facebook philosophy page called Ontologistics, facebook.com/ontologistics. I've just created a newsletter, which I send out every 2 weeks or so, which you can find on my website on the homepage. You can subscribe to. I've got, I'm here, there, and everywhere, really. I'm my publisher is Psychedelic Press. My latest article came out on one of their websites. Yeah, just Google me. You should find something.
Yeah, so all of these links and show notes will be on psychedelicmilk.com/podcast/Peter. And big shout out to Rosalind for setting this up. She's been awesome. And you are awesome as well. And I want to have you back on later this year, maybe, to talk about different things you're working on, because I think you're always working on stuff and learning about new things and looking at them at a different direction or point of view. And I think this is a very interesting conversation, and it's a conversation that needs to be had, because not a lot of people will look at psychedelics and philosophy like you, with your point of view, especially with the moral values that you're talking about. I think that's very important to talk about, because we're supposed to, as people in the psychedelic community, we're supposed to fit in on one side of the political spectrum or whatever the case may be. But I think that's total bullshit. And the more I'm in the psychedelic community, the more I find out about how people tell me I should act. And I think that's complete horseshit. And, I will act in accordance of my own moral compass, but not in this psychedelic hive mind, so to speak. So,
yeah, as William Blake said, if you don't have your own system, you'll be controlled by another man's.
Right. It's just another form of being a sheep. And that's like really an opposite of a real way of a psychedelic person should think. So
yeah. It's not an authentic life, yeah.
Right. So that's really cool that you mentioned that. And I want to thank you once again. And everybody can please check out his work and follow him on Twitter. He's really fascinating. So thank you.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
And that was Peter Sjöstedt. If you guys are interested, the show notes are all available on psychedelicmilk.com/podcast/Peter. And if you guys want to, please leave us a good review on iTunes. It will help out this podcast a lot, and it's only going to take you about 20 to 30 seconds. All you have to do is go to iTunes and search for Psychedelic Milk. Press 5 stars under ratings and reviews, and you're good to go. You don't actually have to write an actual review. All you have to do is press 5 stars, and you're good to go. Thank you guys so much. And again, if you guys want to support this podcast and to keep us going, because we need every dollar and every penny we can get, go to patreon.com/psychedelic milk and keep our podcast, keep our operation strong, and keep the discussion on psychedelics going. Thank you guys so much. Until next week. Bye bye.